If your question does not get addressed tonight, we are looking at potentially doing a follow-up session that we will just work on answering questions, and that will be recorded. And that would be something that you could look at later on. We are recording this. And if you have questions about changing any of your information, you're welcome to do so. We can't see you, and you're also not able to hear you. So just in case you're worrying about that. However, you are welcome to change your name. You could go to the participants section, and if you click on that button, you should find your name, and you should be able to push the more button and change your name if that's a preference for you. I'm going to turn it over to George and Joe. Thank you so much for presenting, gentlemen. This was a topic that was came up in our worlds as something that I thought people really needed to hear about and learn more about. And it was just something that we didn't know was going to resonate with 600 plus people, but we are excited to see that it's been a great turnout, and really hope that you were able to take some great takeaways. Thanks, guys.
Thanks so much, Kelsey. I'm just going to double check that Joe, you can hear me and everyone else can hear me. All right, perfect. I am going to put the slides. So if you're interested in following along, you don't need to. They'll be projected on the screen for the duration of the webinar tonight. But I'll put in the chat a link to the slides, and then you can also see it at the top of our screen as well. And we'll put that link in at the end of the presentation as well. All right, Joe, maybe you could move to the next slide, and are we ready to get started, or?
Yeah, let's do it.
All right, perfect. All right, well, thank you everyone, and welcome. And we'll introduce ourselves in just a moment, but we're happy to have so many people joining us this evening for this talk. And so just to run through a brief outline of what we hope to do tonight. And again, it's a short amount of time, and we hope for a little discussion towards the end. So make liberal use of the chat function. And if we can't get to all of the questions this evening, we'll certainly try to follow up with folks. So we'd like to just, beyond this welcome and overview, provide a land acknowledgement, do some introductions, just to introduce, who am I and my colleague Joe, talk about some starting points. So we're all kind of starting from the same place tonight in terms of treaties and how we're going to be thinking about them and talking about them. We're going to then talk about settler colonialism as a theory and as a framework to help guide some of the ways that we've been thinking about treaties and starting to think about our relationship with treaties. And then we'll talk about this era of treaty making in Minnesota and, to a certain extent nationally in the United States and North America. We'll then think specifically about some treaties in Minnesota or what is today Minnesota. And then we'd like to end with what we're referring to as calls to action, and thinking about how we might and Joe and I will talk about our relationship to these treaties as non-Indigenous Minnesotans, and how we might relate to these treaties and think about some action for moving forward. And then, like I mentioned, hopefully we'll have some time for questions, and we'll certainly at the end on the last slide provide our contact information, and really look forward to engaging with folks more about this topic. So we like to start our presentations with a land acknowledgement. You might be familiar with this practice. It's more common in Canada, Australia, New Zealand, but is becoming more and more common every year in the United States. And so I'll read the statement. And then if you're interested in learning more about land acknowledgements, I put a link at the top that goes to a really robust set of resources that interactive maps that would help you figure out, the land that you're on, who the indigenous inhabitants were and are, and as well as a number of resources to write your own land acknowledgement, including lesson plans for teachers, just a great resource. So this presentation is being conducted from the University of Minnesota Twin Cities, an institution which we acknowledge occupies the ancestral, traditional, and contemporary lands of Indigenous people. It has been the homelands of the Dakota peoples since time immemorial. We further acknowledge that this land was stolen from the Dakota and continues to be occupied illegally. We acknowledge that this land was ceded during the negotiations of the 1837 Treaty of St. Peter's and 1851 Treaties of Traverse des Sioux and Mendota. These treaties with the Dakota were abrogated following the 1862 U.S.-Dakota War and the subsequent expulsion of the Dakota from the state of Minnesota. We recognize that the actions of the United States government and its representatives in Minnesota before, during, and after the U.S.-Dakota War constitute genocide and are part of the larger genocide of Indigenous peoples of the Americas and the United States. We recognize, support, and advocate for Indigenous individuals and communities who live here now, though for those who were forcibly removed from their homelands, as well as Indigenous peoples across the United States and the Americas. By offering this land acknowledgement, we affirm Indigenous sovereignty, and we will work to hold the University of Minnesota and the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies accountable for the continued erasure of Indigenous peoples, cultures, histories, and knowledge from this land. So just to introduce ourselves briefly, so you know who's talking to you tonight. My name is George Delbo, and I am a PhD candidate in the Department of Curriculum and Instruction at the University of Minnesota. And I'm also a full-time practicing social studies teacher. So I taught all day today, and here, this evening I'm in this webinar with you. And my research and my teaching, a lot of it has been focused on genocide education, things like Holocaust, genocide, and human rights, and how these are taken up in curricula and classrooms. And I'm particularly interested in my research and even working with the students that I teach, thinking about narratives of Indigenous genocide in Minnesota and in the Americas and around the world more broadly. And so, though treaties isn't an expertise of mine, certainly it's something that I'm interested in terms of the work that I'm doing. And so maybe with that, Joe, I'll turn it over to you to introduce yourself.
Joe Eggers. I'm the outreach coordinator for the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies. And I've been with the center now for about 3 years. And before that, I worked with the center as a graduate assistant. In my research in grad school, I was interested in how we define genocide and how we think of past events, depending on which lens of genocide we're using to examine them. Most of my work was related to American Indian boarding school system and international law. And I want to reinforce that idea that kind of George alluded to, that neither George or I identify as Native, or nor do either of us really claim to be experts or scholars in this field specifically. Our work looks at one aspect of Native American history through a lens of genocide. And really, I think George and I would agree that our work can probably most be accurately called a critique of settler history, that we're looking at sort of the repercussions in the settler memory of genocide. And George and I, we have not really worked on a lot of treaty things, have worked on representations of the U.S.-Dakota War in Minnesota's newspapers. We looked at areas around Fort Snelling and the Bedote and how we name things. So this is another sort of step in that. George and I have been working together on this sort of topic for now for what, George, 2 or 3 years? Or this is a while now.
Yeah, a little while, yeah.
And I'll say just on one other note about the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies, we were established 25 years ago with the aim to provide resources for educators and tools to equip them to discuss about the Holocaust and other episodes of genocide in classrooms. And since our inception, the center has hosted dozens of scholars from around the world while producing a new generation of experts and making contributions in the field today, George being among the latest. And I just want to plug 2 events coming up for the center, as long as we're talking about the center. On November 9th, we're hosting Wolf Gruner from the USC Shoah Foundation to talk about the personal toll of Jewish victims during Kristallnacht. And of course, November 9th being the 72nd anniversary of Kristallnacht. And then on November 17th, we're hosting Valentina Curlew from the Holodomor Education Resource Consortium at the University of Alberta for our annual Holodomor commemorative lecture. And both of those are listed on our website with links on via Zoom.
All right, so we actually wanted to start this presentation, especially given that neither of us is Native. We wanted to start this presentation with some Native voices and play just a very short video clip that looks at this question of why treaties matter.
Well, I think non-Native people know that treaties were signed. That might be it.
A treaty is fundamentally an agreement between two nations.
Treaties are only made between sovereign governments.
In fact, the U.S. has made more than 300 treaties with American Indian nations.
The United States' existence, when it first won the war against Great Britain, was very precarious, and many countries around the world did not recognize the United States' sovereignty.
So the U.S., as a way to assert that it was a sovereign, it made agreements with Native nations to sort of say to Europe, to Britain, hey, we're sovereign too, we can make these agreements.
The idea that treaties somehow gave status or standing or land to indigenous nations is probably the main fallacy that exists.
I think that many people view treaties as special rights for Indians.
They're not rights given to Native nations. They're Native nations, by and large, giving rights to the United States. I think a lot of people lack an understanding that wherever they live, there's probably a treaty that gives them the right to live there, granted to them by Native nations.
A nation relinquished the majority of its land rights, its land holdings, its resource holdings, for the right to preserve its way of life.
The rights that are reserved are more easily defined by the U.S. courts as property rights, but better defined by our traditional and cultural understandings as being relationship rights to the land, the water, and all of the beings that we hunt and fish and share that world with.
It's through treaties that I think we've been able to hold off a lot of forces that would like to see us erased from the continent.
I'm trying to think of one treaty that from the perspective of the indigenous nation has been fully upheld and implemented.
A lot of people disregard our treaties and say they're a thing of the past, they've been broken, let's forget about them. They would like to wipe away the treaty history of the United States, but that's simply not how it works.
Our United States Constitution recognizes that once a treaty is signed and ratified by the Senate, it becomes the, quote, supreme law of the land.
What that means is that a treaty, it's as much alive as the U.S. Constitution is.
Are they living documents? Do they exist and do they transcend generations? The answer is absolutely yes.
When people question the relevance of treaties and say, I don't think treaties are relevant, my response is, then just give us the land back.
We're not talking about past history, we're talking about today. The best example of that is the Dakota Access Pipeline.
I think we saw before the world community the violation of the 1868 and 1851 treaties of the United States with the Lakota Nation in Standing Rock.
It brought the violation of treaty rights to today. Even though tribes have been experiencing those violations time after time after time,
treaties go both ways.
This was a two-way street, that it was a shared history.
It's about mutual respect.
Non-Native peoples are treaty partners, the descendants of the treaty signers, you could say, on the United States side.
I think that the way that we bring everybody into the conversation is we have curriculum that accurately reflects the reality of what an Indian treaty is. That's something we do for the United States Constitution and the 3 branches of government. Why don't we have a tribal component to that education?
The ancestors who negotiated the treaties, they were doing their best to protect us, to protect our culture, and protect our way of life.
And to me, that's a responsibility. in which I should live my life every day to remember, to honor those ancestors that fought so I could be here today.
Treaties are living documents because tribes continue to breathe life into them. We continue to speak their terms. We continue to remember the promises.
So I think Joe and I, and Joe alluded to this, and I have as well, and we'll say it again, right? That we are not Indigenous, and I think part of our interest in starting to explore treaties is certainly this question. Our work has been mostly around genocide, but thinking about certainly treaties and the connections to genocide and the genocide of Indigenous peoples, and trying to draw some of those connections. But I think also for me, and I think for Joe as well, this idea that as non-native Minnesotans, we've rarely been confronted with thinking about our relationship with these treaties, with the treaties that were signed in Minnesota or affect the state that is now the land that is now Minnesota. And, so we were interested in kind of approaching this presentation from that, taking up this notion of we are all treaty people. And, what would it mean for us as non-native Minnesotans to, think about our relationship and even obligations under these treaties. And so starting to explore, some of what was left out of certainly my education, right, but our education, and even, as thinking about my work at the university in a PhD program and how little I've been asked to think about some of these treaties and my relationship to them. And so building on some of what was said in the short video clip that we played, we wanted to just provide some starting points for folks to think about. And this is really, we'll be kind of moving forward from these, kind of basic starting points, these statements of understanding about treaties and relationships to them. And so first, treaties are not simply historic relics, but they are living documents and are still part of the law of the land. And I think certainly as a teacher, there were many years I taught social studies where I taught about, different aspects of government, but rarely would I think about treaties, right? And relations with Indigenous peoples as belonging in a unit where we're looking at, say, the three branches of government, right? Or other aspects of local or federal government. And so trying to think about why that is and push beyond that. Treaties do not grant Indigenous nations or peoples rights, rather treaties preserve some Indigenous rights. And really, I like this statement that treaties are giving rights from Indigenous peoples to the United States. Treaties were negotiated between the United States government and Indigenous nations on a nation-to-nation basis, and we'll talk more about this. But I think it's important to recognize that unequal power relations between the United States and Indigenous nations often led to unjust outcomes. And I think it's important to mention, right, that treaties, and we'll talk a little bit about settler colonialism on the next slide, but treaties were and are used as tools to maintain settler supremacy and settler futurity in the United States. So the maintenance of the settler colonial nation state, and I'll expand on that in just a moment. But I think it's also important to say that treaties also have been used and are used as a demonstration of to ensure Indigenous sovereignty. Thanks, Joe. So I put all of this up at once, right? And I want to walk through just a little bit about settler colonialism. In a very basic sense, we could say that settler colonialism is the notion that Europeans, right, or others came to the United States, or what will become the United States, to this land, to Minnesota, and have settled here. Whereas we might talk about other places that were colonized where Europeans came and, maybe didn't remove the indigenous inhabitants from the land, and certainly did damage in those places, but at some point, in some cases, even left, and the land was largely returned back to the people that had lived there previously. And I think in settler colonial nation states and settler colonial societies, we see Europeans come and settle and occupy the land for generations, right? Pass down ownership of this land to their children and their children's children. And this necessarily means removing the original indigenous inhabitants from that land. And so when we talk about settler colonialism, often I like to use this idea of a triangle, right, or a triad, and think of these three different elements of settler society. And so at the top, we might think of the notion of settler. The settlers remove indigenous inhabitants from the land. Sometimes this is physical extermination, genocide. Sometimes this is relocation. They then settle this stolen land and settle it in perpetuity, generation after generation. They create laws and structures within settler society to legitimize the genocide and the theft and the continued domination of this land. And often we associate settlerness with, especially in the United States, whiteness. And if we think about in settler colonial societies like the United States and Canada, often there is the removal. So if we think about this, the idea of an Indian and, what is on the left here, that Indians, right, are removed from the land and also erased from the narrative, or the narratives that are developed in society. So for me, I think about education. They're often held in imagined 19th century stereotypes. And so the way that we depict, and you can see, of course, the logo here, right, depicting Native Americans in this kind of imagined 19th century stereotypical way. They're often termed savages, or indeed much worse. And certainly with this, not seen as human beings. And we associate this with the notion of Indianness, which, of course, it's important to remember that before 1492, right, there were no Indians. This is an identity that was thrust upon groups of people who had, a myriad of different cultural traditions and histories. And then often within settler colonial society, we see the importation of slave labor. And so we could think of in the Americas, right, the importation of slave labor from Africa. And slaves, right, this notion of slave, right, slaves are often held in bondage via enslavement. And when enslavement in the United States ends, we could think of things like segregation or the modern day prison industrial complex, or things like debt that hold people in bondage. We could think that slaves are often not seen as human beings, but they are rather seen as property, and therefore their bodies are valued, not their personhood. They're restricted from owning land and often associated with notions in the United States of blackness. And so we could think of, recently some of the conversation around depictions of African Americans as slaves, right, or as, enslaved peoples, or even peoples post-enslavement. And similarly, some of the conversations around depictions of Native Americans and how that might fit within this understanding of a settler colonial nation state. Settler colonial society is often, I think of this in the center of the triangle, is what holds settler society in place. And I often think of things like treaties or laws, right, that justify the theft of land and the continued occupation, this settler futurity that allows settlers to occupy this land in perpetuity. Or we could think of institutions such as policing, certainly has been a conversation conversation recently. But things like education as well, right, as institutions that help to justify settler society and give this shape generation after generation. And I think it's important to note that, settler society, we do see shifts over time, right, as, narratives change, as understandings and relationships and ideas change. But this, basic structure has largely held for hundreds of years. And so though it might shift, the basic structure is still maintained through these different institutions, laws, and treaties.
I think that's a really good transition into talking about an overview of treaty making in the United States. And I think we should talk a little bit more about how the United States approached treaty making with Native nations. And it's, I think, critical to understand that this wasn't really black and white, but instead evolved as the U.S. strengthened its territorial gains across the continent. And as attitudes towards Native peoples changed and shifted, as being sovereign individuals to being wards of the state, so to the language found in the treaties. The idea of treaties being mutually beneficial gave way to coercive treaties that not only took land, but included elements meant to assimilate Native people into American society. And ultimately, by 1871, the era of treaty making was over and replaced by congressional acts and laws that codified the attempts to assimilate Native people in the United States, or into the United States. So let's look a little bit more closely at treaty making in Minnesota specifically. And when we look at it from a broad overview, we can see similar trends here. Early on, treaties were meant and intended to be critical tools for alliance building, especially in the aftermath of the War of 1812, and for establishing trade agreements. But by 1825, here treaties with Native nations in Minnesota were almost entirely centered on ceding land in exchange for payments, guaranteed land rights, and other agreements. So now let's dive in more specifically at Minnesota. And here we have the treaties between the Dakota and the federal government that directly impacted Minnesota. And although we're talking specifically tonight, maybe a little bit more about northern Minnesota, I think these series are particularly telling about the enormous gulf that exists between the intentions of the federal representatives and Native people signing these treaties. The first treaty we have there was here the Dakota and the Americans was signed when Zebulon Pike's expedition went through the area following the Louisiana Purchase, and just 2 years after the purchase itself. In 1805, the treaty ceded land that would be known as Pike Island on what is now today Fort Snelling, or to the Dakota, the Bedote. And later on, there was confusion about the amount of money that was in the land and even the validity of the treaty itself. And ultimately, the Dakota traded the land to a fur trader. And I think this speaks to an incredible different perspective that settlers and the federal government and indigenous people had towards the land. By 1858, a series of treaties had relegated the Dakota to 2 reservations along the Minnesota River. And just 5 years later, the Dakota would be removed in the aftermath of the Dakota War of 1862. Now let's look a little bit more closely at treaties with the Ojibwe. And through 1855, we see a similar course of treaties to that of the Dakota treaties. They reflect federal policies, especially Andrew Jackson's Indian removal policies of 1837 that removed tribes east of the Mississippi westward. And I'll say this now, and it's not surprising, that many of these treaties are the result of intertwined and corrupt agreements between government officials and private business interests. The 1837 treaty opened up northeast Minnesota and northern Wisconsin to lumber harvesting. Not surprisingly, lumber interests were heavily represented in these agreements. Many of these agreements in Minnesota here were negotiated by Henry Sibley, who directly benefited, these treaties directly benefited his own business interests. And when we talk about these being coercive treaties, it's not just because they exploited Native nations, but almost because they wholly supported private enterprises early on. And actually, I'll make a plug for this book, The Relentless Business of Treaties, by Martin Case. I know George is going to talk about it later on, but it does a fascinating job of talking through the business interests and some of the people behind the treaties made in Minnesota here. But I'll say that the 1854 treaty is also noteworthy because it preserved the hunting and fishing rights that Minnesota courts have upheld repeatedly in the subsequent 160 years. And I think it demonstrates, too, that notion that we were talking about earlier on, and the video said about treaties being living documents that even today that the state must recognize. And so before we start talking about the treaties post-1862, we need to talk a little bit about the U.S.-Dakota War. And I think a lot of us think about the U.S.-Dakota War as being a watershed moment in Minnesota history for the Dakota, but we should really be thinking about it as a critical moment for all U.S. Indigenous relationships. First, in 1863, the United States unilaterally revoked all of its treaties with the Dakota. That's why when we're talking about treaties being upheld in Minnesota, it's exclusively with the Ojibwe. The United States never again signed a treaty with the Dakota after 1863. Second, the action of abrogating the treaties with the Dakota is very telling about the government's attitudes towards treaties with Native peoples. It shouldn't be surprising that just 8 years later, the federal government abandoned this policy altogether. And finally, and more closely to home, the Ojibwe almost experienced a similar fate to the Dakota. During the height of the 1862 war, dispatches of soldiers were sent to northern Minnesota to determine the threat the Ojibwe faced or posed in the state. And here on the screen now we have an example of one of those dispatches that appeared in an, I believe it was September 1862 newspaper in St. Paul. The same newspapers that were calling for the wholesale slaughter of Dakota and Minnesota also called for the removal of the Ojibwe and resettlement west. It means likely we can think about the treaties with the Ojibwe would have probably been at least voided post 1862, similar to the Dakota, if there had actually been a war. The other thing I'll point out with these late treaties is that the language in them is more blatant and apparent and obvious that it incentivizes assimilation. And of course, we know that no treaty after 1867 existed between the U.S. government and the Ojibwe. And again, all treaty making was abandoned after 1871. So before we move on, I think too we should talk a little bit about some of these highlighting these policies that replaced treaty making in the United States as we see the shifts towards more of assimilation policies and more assimilation language in treaties. Some of these are probably familiar with. We can talk a little bit more if there's questions at the end about them specifically. But I think what, again, it's important to remember is all of this language here erodes that idea of sovereignty. That the language in the treaties eroded that, and then these congressional acts continued to erode, if not completely ignore, Native sovereignty at a federal level. And that's something I think it's really important to talk about too, and George will talk about it in a second, is that these issues are still being faced today. Like this isn't something that is a historical example. This is something that I think a lot of tribes and communities are facing today. I will just point out Red Lake here on this list, which was able to avoid the effects of, Public Law 280, which maintained jurisdiction over Red Lake's land by the tribe itself. They were able to do so by the chair of the tribe at that time, negotiating and reinforcing and pushing towards those treaty rights. So we have those used to protect the sovereignty a bit of the tribes in, at least in Red Lake.
Yeah, and so just thinking about treaties and how some of this, it emerges in discourse today, right, in the news media. And so I pulled just a couple of examples, right, from the hundreds that exist from local news sources. A lot of what we see is, talk around hunting and fishing rights, and indeed fighting over, between indigenous peoples who are trying trying to exercise their rights, and a lot of non-Indigenous folks in some cases, right, who are trying to prevent them. And I think it's important, right, in looking through a lot of these articles, it does get a little murky, right, in trying to understand what do we actually mean by treaty rights. And, certainly some of these seem to suggest that these are rights that are, treaty rights are those that are given, around hunting and fishing, let's say, to Indigenous communities or Indigenous nations in Minnesota and elsewhere, not that they are rights that were preserved through these treaties. And so I think, this is where we most see the conversation today. But I think it's important to recognize, right, that these treaties allow for Indigenous, to quote Gerald Vinzenor, right, Indigenous survivance or Indigenous futures, around things like economic development and sustainability for Indigenous nations, resource use and conservation. And I think most importantly, they allow, right, treaties often allow for the maintenance of Indigenous sovereignty over lands, right? But also, I think, cultural maintenance as well, right? To preserve important cultural traditions that otherwise would be lost. And so, well, I think it's easy for non-Indigenous Minnesotans to bump up against treaties. And certainly this was my experience, right, for many years in just thinking about hunting and fishing rights without pushing deeper to think about, what is being preserved in the fight to exercise these treaty rights around, let's say, hunting and fishing. And that really it is about sovereignty, cultural maintenance, economic development and sustainability. And certainly runs much deeper than I think the kind of narrative that exists, the discourse in the news media would lead us to believe.
So this leads us to a question here, is when are treaties genocidal? And it's something that George and I have talked a lot about, especially lately as we're preparing for this presentation. And it's something that I admittedly go back and forth on. As genocide scholars, and fortunately not lawyers, we have different ways and different tools to look at this through a lens of genocide. The first being, this genocide is a theory developed by Raphael Lemkin in 1944, and subsequently adopted and revised and analyzed countless times by scholars since then. And what that allows us to do is look at different types of genocide, right? We have the physical genocide that we think about in terms of mass violence. We have economic, social, cultural, biological genocide. But what this does is gives us a better lens, a more nuanced way to look at how events of the past could be construed as genocide. And then we have genocide as law, which is what we find in the UN Genocide Convention. It's something that the U.S. is a signatory to. This is codified international law that provides a legal, defendable mechanism for understanding genocide. And then finally, we have genocide as proposed law. This is something that the international community has come together and said, look, in theory, this is how we'd want to critique this and develop this idea of cultural genocide, which I think when we're talking about, especially for me, is what I think about when I think of genocide of Indigenous peoples, especially in terms of assimilation. The problem is this was never adopted by the international community. The U.S. opposed it, and it was removed from its draft status. And the other challenge is that this is from the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People. And of course, a declaration is not an enforceable mechanism of international law. It's just something that we sort of altruistically hold to be something ideal. And so that leaves us, leaves us with an idea, this idea that we have different ways of looking at genocide, but what do all of these have in common? And for me, it comes on the fact that they're almost exclusively written by white men using Western notions of law, people, land, and all have these accompanying biases. And it's something that I have myself too as I do my work, and I can evaluate my own things. but I fall into that trap too. So I guess the question we want to pose to everyone here is what do we think? Do we think that treaties can be thought of as genocidal? Are they something else? Are we missing something in this? But this maybe is an opportunity for us to share. And I think I did a poll. I've never done a poll before. But based on everything that George and I have talked about tonight, what do you think? Were these policies genocidal? Were treaties not? Are they something else? Do you not know? But I'd be really curious to hear what you think, because again, this is something that George and I go back on. I don't know, George, if you have what your thoughts are.
Yeah, no, I mean, like Joe, I think there are times that I have taken up genocide to think about, the experience of Indigenous peoples in the United States. And certainly there are Indigenous scholars that I've read and talked with that take up this notion as well. And though I haven't seen it taken up too specifically with the talk around treaties, it's something that is a little uneasy for me too, because I recognize how important treaties are as living documents that provide for, Indigenous sovereignty and everything that I was talking about, on the previous slide. And so I think for me, it's uneasy to think about treaties and treaty making as part of this genocidal process, recognizing how important they are for contemporary Indigenous survivance and, recognizing that these were documents that were negotiated on, in many cases, a nation-to-nation basis. But then, of course, coming back to the idea that there was this unequal power, that there were unequal power relations between the United States and Indigenous nations. And so I think for me, there is this kind of uneasy tension that exists.
Well, I think that's what makes it such a difficult example to really look at, right? Because it's coercive in the sense that you have these enshrined rights that these treaties protect, but also at the same time you have this coercive attempt to, destroy frameworks of families, promoting allotment, adopting Christianity, things that are listed in these treaties. And that to me is what makes it you're right. It makes it a real challenge because they are so critical today.
A note for those that are new to doing surveys, you take your mouse and you would take it over the comment of genocide, not genocide, something else. I'm not sure what they are, and you should just roll over and click, and then in a little bit they will show us the results of what we all think.
Yeah, and I can see people putting comments in, right, that are coming almost too quickly for me to read them, but, catching a few snippets. And I think, I mentioned this at the beginning in talking about settler colonialism as a framework and how treaties really were used as a way by settler society to justify, the theft of Indigenous land. And I think this is a sentiment that is shared by many scholars in thinking about how treaties, and this treaty-making process was approached certainly by many non-Indigenous Euro-Americans who understood the importance not of negotiating nation to nation perhaps, but understood the importance in many ways of, this as a mechanism for stealing land. Which we could think of as an aspect of genocide, perhaps, right? Yes.
Are you good for pulling up the poll and turning it off so we can see your beautiful faces again?
Well, George, should we move on and then we can look at the poll at the end?
We still see the poll until you turn.
Oh, you still see the poll on top. Oh, wow. Okay, I guess we're going to wrap it up then. This is, again, my first poll, so I'm glad it worked.
George, it looks like for some people they couldn't, and Joe, they couldn't see the poll. Maybe we'll skip, we'll do it at the end.
Yeah, here we go. Yeah, we'll reopen it at the end here.
Does this show? I'm not sure what I'm seeing versus participants, and I'm sorry about that.
Yeah, but showed the results. Great.
Oh, perfect. Okay. Yeah, and I'm so curious to look back through some of these comments, and we'll make a few comments here just in closing, perhaps, and then turn things over to a Q&A and hopefully be able to address some of the comments and have a little bit more of a discussion as the webinar format allows. All right. So I think if I close that, are people still looking at the poll, Kelsey, or?
I closed it out.
You're good to go.
All right, perfect. So we wanted to think about a few calls maybe, and some of what we've been thinking about in terms of action regarding treaties and our relationship to treaties, especially as non-Indigenous Minnesotans. And one for us certainly has been educating ourselves about the history of treaty making in Minnesota. And I think this is the first that I've really, in looking through some of this, really thought through and confronted by the history of various treaties, right? And so I think first is educate yourself about treaty making in Minnesota and across North America, and certainly seeking multiple perspectives. And I think Indigenous and non-Indigenous perspectives and different sources of knowledge about this history. One thing is reflecting on our relationship with treaties and Indigenous communities in general. And certainly for me, looking at some of the conversation that's happening in Canada, and especially north of us in Manitoba, has been very instructive in thinking about Manitobans' relationship to treaties, especially non-Indigenous Manitobans, and certainly forming relationships with Indigenous communities. And I think part of this for me has been to think about reflecting on dominant assumptions that I've held around land ownership and land use policies in Minnesota. Certainly one of the things that Joe and I have looked quite extensively at is the idea of parkland and, how parkland is often, if it's city or, state or national parkland, is often seen by non-Indigenous folks as neutral land that's open to anyone to use for, a myriad of different purposes. But recognizing how parkland is, also a form of settlement, and it is a tool that is used by the state, right, the settler colonial nation state, to control land. And then, of course, support Indigenous communities across Minnesota and the United States and indeed elsewhere, and their stances and efforts regarding land use and exercising treaty rights. And then I think, for me, something that's been near and dear to my heart is thinking about advocating for treaty education in Minnesota schools, and advocating for, indeed, beyond even just treaty education, which I think would be an amazing start, but advocating for critical settler and indigenous perspectives in curricula in classrooms. And again, I think to a certain extent, we could look to Canada and to Manitoba and see what's been done there, but also I think recognize some of the Indigenous critiques to the ways in which treaty education and Indigenous perspectives have been brought into largely non-Indigenous classrooms across Canada or Manitoba, and think, how could we in Minnesota learn from some of those efforts? And I'm excited to see that there is a process right now to remake the social studies standards in Minnesota, and thinking about the possibilities for bringing Indigenous perspectives into those revised standards. And so we also wanted, just knowing that people have access to the slides, include a number of resources. Certainly there are many, many others. And so we were trying to think of things that would be approachable for people that have relatively little, background in thinking about treaties. And certainly Joe mentioned it, the Martin Case's The Relentless Business of Treaties was a fascinating read for me, and thinking about, who's writing these, who's signing these treaties, who's negotiating these treaties, and their relationship to treaty making, and especially thinking about non-Indigenous Euro-Americans and, their motivations. Certainly David Troyer's Res Life is a fascinating read that touches on much more than just treaties, but contemporary Indigenous life. I'll say that is set in Minnesota, right? The story of Act 31 is a fascinating read written by J.P. Leary, who's a professor of Indigenous Studies at the University of Wisconsin, Green Bay. Act 31 is the law that mandates treaty education and Indigenous education in all public schools in Wisconsin. And though Minnesota doesn't have a similar law, it's interesting to think about the possibilities for a state like Minnesota, and certainly looking, north to Manitoba, but also to our neighbors in Wisconsin, and thinking about the efforts that have been made there. And so this really tells the story of, how this law came to be in the late 1980s and early 1990s, and is just a fascinating read. And then certainly the Why Treaties Matter is an exhibit. It's a website, so it's an online and also an exhibit that exists that travels around the state of Minnesota. It's located in the Minnesota Capitol building, which was a huge coup for the creators of this, right? To have this located in the Capitol building. I think in some ways, unfortunately, it's located in a hallway on the third floor, if memory serves, of the Capitol building, out of sight in some ways from even some of the tours, unfortunately, that take people through the Capitol building. But important nonetheless that there is this exhibit about the importance of treaties in Minnesota that's, in the Capitol building. And I would encourage everyone to look through the website, and, it's rich with short video clips of Minnesotan, Indigenous folks from across Minnesota talking about the importance of treaties and treaty rights.
Yeah, I'll just echo that and say the Why Treaties Matters website is fantastic and has not only the context and the background of the treaty, but you can read the treaties themselves and get really into understanding all of it. I don't think there was a question. Someone asked one of that we were going to get into more detailed conversation about the treaties themselves. And I think there's just shortness of time, but I would highly encourage you to check out Why Treaties Matters. It's just a fabulous website.
Yeah, and then we would love to jump into some questions. And I think we have close to about 30 minutes, 25, 30 minutes to hopefully have Kelsey ask us a few questions that we can respond to and poke through the chat ourselves. And then certainly if there's too much, which I imagine there is to get into tonight, we'll try to think of ways that we can engage with this topic further and engage with folks. But I did want to mention that our email addresses are here. So George, Wright, and Joe, and we would love to hear from folks if you have questions or just you want to follow up with comments. We'd love to think through things with folks via email. And then I also put in just, Kelsey mentioned certainly Cook County Higher Education, and we are just delighted to be able to partner with you all and make this available. And then the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies at the University of Minnesota, which has been such a sponsor of my work and supported my work and where Joe works and so certainly check out future events.
You ready for some questions? We have a handful of them. Hold on a second. First one, are you seeing and hearing anything that makes you hopeful that our education system is going to start teaching students about treaties and Indigenous histories, as well as current Indigenous cultures and communities, etc.?
And I'm sorry, can you just say the first couple of words? Is it, am I hopeful or are we hopeful?
Yep. Are you seeing or hearing anything that makes you hopeful?
Okay, perfect. Sorry, I just missed the beginning there. Yeah, no. I think, unfortunately, no, right? And so I can say a little bit about the Standards Committee. I'm not on it, though I do quite a bit of work in social studies education. And so I've followed, and I know folks that are on the Standards Committee. It's hopeful to me that there is representation, Indigenous representation on the Standards Committee to do this kind of revision of the state social studies standards, which is happening right now this academic year. And so I imagine they would be pushing for more representation in education. Yeah, but I think, unfortunately, as much as I'd like to say yes, and there have been changes over time, I think we still see that in a lot of classrooms, Indigenous issues, treaties are not being taken up. Probably mostly where you would see some of this being taken up would be in history classrooms. And I'd like to see government and civics classes taking up treaties and treaty making and, pushing students to think about this line that we use to title the presentation, that we are all treaty people, and what is our relationship and our obligation to these treaties, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous. But I think, unfortunately, and I mentioned this at the beginning, that education is a tool of settler colonialism. And I think, often what we see are these processes of erasure where, when Indigenous peoples are talked about, it is in, the past. It's these 19th century narratives that have bred these stereotypes that we still have lingering with us today. And even in Wisconsin, I can say where there is this Act 31 and there has been, more funding and more efforts to get treaty education into schools. I think people that are connected with Indigenous education in Wisconsin would like to see much more of it. Yes and no, I think, is maybe my answer to that.
And I think too, George, that there's this idea that if it's included in the standards, that it'll automatically make its way into classrooms. And what we know is that's just not true, is that there's a divide between what's in standards and what's actually being taught in classrooms. And I think that's why it's really important that we connect with teachers and give them resources and the expertise and the tools to be able to equip them to talk about these these topics in classrooms, because the standards don't put what has to be taught, but they don't actually follow through, I think, in a lot of providing resources for teachers. So there is no guarantee even.
Yeah, you're so right, Joe. I think, teachers make most of the decisions, right, as gatekeepers in a sense, in terms of what happens in their individual classrooms. And we know that most teachers in Minnesota are, white, and probably don't have themselves a background in thinking through Indigenous issues, and probably for the most part, and I can speak to my own experience, weren't asked to think about this in many ways in their own preparation to become social studies or other teachers. And and I think, from what I can say, there are teachers that are very willing, many teachers, want to do right by their students and are very willing to take up some of this, but may not know where to even start.
George and I did a survey of Minnesota teachers to understand how and what they're teaching when it comes to the U.S.-Dakota War, because it's part of state standards, the 2010 standards. And we found, George, that only about half of teachers are actually talking about 1862 in the classrooms. And oftentimes they're pointing to the lack of resources and the lack of material to talk about this, plus the time restraints. I mean, there's so many factors that keep teachers from engaging this in the classroom. So we could talk about this for a while. We do a lot of education talks.
Let's bring up the next question. Hold on one second. I know that there was a recent Supreme Court ruling on Native American treaties, specifically in Oklahoma. How does that affect Native American sovereignty?
Whoa, yeah. So this is an area where I know some, but not a lot. I know it was a monumental court case, but in talking to some of our colleagues in American Indian Studies at the university, it's exciting, but it's not as exciting as it was made out to be. It's not as if Oklahoma will be ceded back to Cherokee and other tribal lands. In essence, my understanding is that it recognizes tribal jurisdiction over those lands. There's a really good podcast series that I listened to actually just on a road trip. And I'm sorry, I'm going to pull it up on my phone. I'll be that person. George, if you have anything to add while I'm looking this up, please go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I'll say that I think, it's important that these cases are coming before courts, right? And I think that there is a precedent that's being set here as well. So, to echo what Joe is saying, that I think, a lot of the hype that, especially in the immediate aftermath, maybe was a little overblown in terms of what I've also heard from colleagues, that, this isn't going to be as important as maybe, we were led to believe looking at newspaper headlines. But certainly the precedent is important.
Yeah, the podcast is called This Land, and it's by a Cherokee scholar, I believe she's Cherokee, an indigenous scholar or a reporter who followed the court case along and tracked the case that led to the Supreme Court case and the laws, so the news behind it. So it's a fascinating, I think it was about 8 or 10 episodes. Very, very good. I recommend it.
You ready for another question? Awesome. What does a land acknowledgement actually accomplish? It just seems like a way for white people to deal with their collective guilt.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is a very fair critique of land acknowledgements. And I think especially the way they're often taken up, that we're going to acknowledge the land that we're on as is Indigenous land and then quickly move on to the business of, whatever the presentation is or the class. I mean, I've seen them used in classes at the university and certainly not as common, but, in K-12 world. Yeah, I mean, I think it is, and, many people have said this, it is a starting point. And I think, thinking about the situation that we're in Minnesota, in the United States in general, in many ways, this is an important starting point. It's a necessary step for many people to recognize that we are indeed on Indigenous land. But hopefully that's not where it ends, right? So that this recognition then leads to, deeper education and understanding and connections. And so certainly I think the critique that this is just a way for white people to relieve themselves of some guilt that they might be carrying in relation to their relationship with Native Americans, certainly. But I think, hopefully this is a step to, unsettling or rethinking some of the other practices. And, there are people who have offered suggestions on how to write more meaningful land acknowledgements. Certainly I can say in the land acknowledgement that I use, which I changed slightly, based on the presentation and things like that, was written looking, doing a lot of research about not only Minnesota and the history of the land, but then doing as much research as I can, folks who have written about land acknowledgements, but then also reaching out to Indigenous, communities that I have connections with and Indigenous people. And, I want to be careful to say that, I don't think as settler institutions or as non-Indigenous people, we should, be turning to Indigenous folks and asking for their labor for free and saying, can't you write me a land acknowledgement, or can't you offer your expertise, in helping me construct this land acknowledgement. But I think also recognizing that we should be partnering with Indigenous communities and seeking advice and guidance and following their lead in many ways on, what a land acknowledgement should look like. I'll say, the University of Minnesota doesn't have a land acknowledgement currently, and they're in the process of creating one. And so hence a land acknowledgement that I wrote and, certainly would defer to theirs, thinking about this institution that I'm connected with and, the connections that they're making to then create a land acknowledgement for the university with Indigenous communities around the state. But certainly it's a very valid critique.
Okay, we got another one for you. When did the Anishinaabe then occupy Minnesota? I feel like that one we can pull up, but hoping one of you guys can quickly address.
Well, I don't know. Off the top of my head, I would have to look I'm bad with specific dates.
Yeah, and I'm unfortunately going to punt on that as well, right? I think it's a history that I'm not overly familiar with, and even though I could hazard a guess, I hesitate to say something publicly, and then, yeah.
If we miss a question, we will definitely go back and address it as well.
Yeah.
Another one up. The 1889 Red Lake Treaty, they have some question marks around that. Anything you can talk to about that?
Yeah, that's a really weird time in Minnesota history. And so maybe I provided an oversimplified sort of version of how everything's go. I would know that I have been known to maybe do that. 1887, the Dawes Act allotted tribal lands throughout the country, but there were some that were excluded from that. And I believe the Red Lake were. And so the Nelson Act in 1889, and there might have been some accompanying treaties along with that, that ceded land over towards allotment. I don't know 100% sure. I'm not 100% sure. This is a gray area where I'm not 100%. That's somewhere around there. There's probably someone in the chat who knows specifically more about that than I do. So I don't want to say I'm necessarily punting, but I'm sort of punting.
So then somebody asks, are there stories behind each treaty? Do you have information to share about any of these stories?
Yeah, I mean, there's things behind every one of the treaties. There's stories, there's rationale, there's some are more interesting than others, and some are probably a little bit more relevant now today than others. Again, I would highly recommend checking out the Why Treaties Matters. We'll provide a context for every single one of the treaties and more background than I definitely could. In terms of specific individual treaties, that's not particularly my area of expertise. I can paint in fairly broad strokes, but when it comes to the minutia of individual specific treaties and the details within, that's where I get a little bit gray.
Yeah, I'll say I think this speaks to, and I want to say almost the complexity of the treaties, but really I think it speaks to the lack of information that, we are often, confronted with in contemporary non-Indigenous Minnesotan society right around these treaties that makes them seem so hazy and complicated, overly complicated, these histories. But I will say, in looking at the histories of these treaties, there are scholars that point out that there's a lot of information that remains unknown. And so I think a lot of the narratives we get around the treaties and, how they came to be, especially if we're getting information from non-Indigenous folks, falls within a very narrow narrative. And, I think this is part of Martin Case's work, is to expand our understanding of who is signing these treaties and, not just how the United States benefited perhaps, but how individuals like Henry Sibley were benefiting from treaty making as well on a very personal level.
Great. Another question. Can you discuss the relationship of the Doctrine of Discovery of 1493 to the treaties with Indigenous people in Minnesota? The Doctrine of Discovery of 1493.
George, you want to go first?
Sure. Yeah. No, I think this lays a framework, right? Certainly for, the way in which through colonization, Europeans, right, or later Euro-Americans will interact with Native Americans, right, with Indigenous folks, and thinking about, how we understand land use and land ownership, or just land in general, right, and its relationship with human beings. And I think this is going to be the framework, the theory, the lens through which, right, many Euro-Americans are going to approach, right, and I think it's something that's passed down through treaty making, right, in the way that we approach land, and certainly still today, right, think about how we think about our relationship with land, and that there is this right for Euro-Americans to be on this land, to have control over the land and the resources. I think this is very much the worldview that I was brought up within, and it's difficult to shake. I can say for myself, right? I find myself slipping back into this often. Absolutely.
Yeah, and I'll say too, to again get another plug for Martin Case's book. His introductory chapter goes through and talks about early American court cases and reinforce using some of these past documents, especially papal doctrine, to legitimize legal precedent for land claims and land law that essentially we have today.
Yeah, and I'll say too, Chris Montanumpa, who is a Dakota elder and scholar, a retired professor of Indigenous studies, he has done quite a bit of work around, and I think has a book either coming out or maybe it has come out, and I've missed it just in the last little while here, but about essentially looking at how Euro-Americans in Minnesota and elsewhere looked at religion, and used religion and religious texts and Christianity in particular, right, to justify, the theft of land and occupation of land. And, again, it's an area that I couldn't speak too eloquently about, but I'm always fascinated in talking to Chris about the work that he's doing and, thinking about how religion was used as justification for land theft.
Okay, some more questions. Any statutes that allow or support use of land acknowledgements in the workplace? My employer has implemented a policy that forbids land acknowledgements for use in email signatures. I was forced to remove the one I had written.
Interesting. I'm not aware of any. I'm going to make a note myself just because
I am wholly unqualified to give any kind of legal advice. That sounds like a very delicate situation that I would yield to anybody else with more legal expertise than me.
Yeah, but certainly unfortunate that would be the case. And I'm thinking my own, the various institutions that I'm engaged with and the email addresses I have and, my own land acknowledgement statements that are in those email addresses. It's I will say as a teacher, right, not from my email signature, but I have faced pushback from, colleagues and indeed parents in starting classes with land acknowledgements and encouraging students. I've had assignments in the past where I've asked students to kind of research and write a land acknowledgement, and have experienced a little bit of pushback from, not tons certainly, but a little bit of pushback from parents and even fellow staff, right, who are questioning, the controversial nature of that sort of assignment, right, or questioning the usefulness of that sort of assignment. So I think it's unfortunate that we still, bump up against a little bit of this.
Okay, another one. Something not often mentioned is the Ho-Chunk tribe also occupied the land in Minnesota that civilly stole during the Dakota War. Do you know much about this?
Yeah, the Ho-Chunk were resettled from Wisconsin. I believe it was part of the Indian Removal Act, moving tribes west of the Mississippi, and so were resettled in western Minnesota. But removed in 1862 or 1863 as part of the aftermath of the U.S. Dakota War. And it's weird as my understanding of the U.S. Dakota War is really shaped by reading newspapers from 1862. And while we have obviously a clear response to the Dakota and even a sort of a perceived threat from Ojibwe, the Ho-Chunk never are mentioned. They're just mentioned as sort of a casual victim getting caught up in all of this. I think part of the reason why they get overlooked is because their time in Minnesota was fairly brief. And I don't believe there were any treaties signed while they were in Minnesota to land. I could be wrong. But again, at that time, I think it was only a couple of decades. They were actually settled in Minnesota before they were moved elsewhere.
Yeah, and I can see too, just thinking about Wisconsin in the Ho-Chunk, nation in Wisconsin, and is, a nation without land, and is, working actively to purchase land and turn it into tribal lands, but I think are often overlooked in Wisconsin as well, though they are recognized in Wisconsin, right, as one of the recognized tribes in Wisconsin. But I think even in Wisconsin, the Ho-Chunk struggle for recognition in places like education, right? Absolutely.
Okay, you ready for another one?
Sure.
What are your thoughts on the recent book by Stacy Lola Jouillard, Walking the Old Road? What are some things that Grand Marais residents can do to acknowledge this history and begin to reforge relationships with the former residents of Chippewa City and the current residents of Grand Portage? And I'm not sure you guys are familiar with that, but it is something that we will be addressing through Cook County Higher Ed. So just in case you don't have a lot of insight at this point.
Yeah, I'm not familiar. I mean, I'll have to stay tuned for that. Yeah.
Yeah, so we will be having 2 workshops coming up in November and December to hopefully bring some of those conversations to light, encouraging reading of her book, which is about Cook County. And her stories are really valid and important and great storytelling as well. Let's bring up another one then.
I mean, I will say, too, one way to be involved and educated is participating in these Cook County higher education workshops. These are fantastic. I live in Minneapolis, and coming across these community ed classes here is rather difficult. I can't believe we have such a fantastic resource up there. This is great.
Thank you, guys. Appreciate it. We try to do what we can with very little funding and support, but we are very lucky to have what we have and try to do the best we can. Able bodies, right? They can do more things. Can you give us more of the coming potential revising of Minnesota history education standards? Is this happening now? If not now, when?
So this is revising the history standards? Sorry, Kelsey.
Yep, correct.
Okay, yeah. So like I said, I'm not on the standards committee, and so I don't want to speak too much, for the committee. I do know a few folks, and I've followed the process a little bit just, because of my interest in social studies education. But yes, the Minnesota State Social Studies standards, and so for those that don't know, right, these are the standards that guide what social studies teachers K-12, so from kindergarten through 12th grade, would teach. And I think Joe made the point, right, that there are these standards and teachers are obligated, right, legally to follow, or schools to teach to these standards. But certainly the very decentralized nature of education in the United States and in Minnesota means that a lot of decisions are left up to individual districts or schools or even just classroom teachers to make decisions. And so, I don't want to overstate the importance of these standards, but certainly I think referencing treaties, treaty education, Indigenous issues in these standards would be hugely important, right, as a step towards making sure that that gets into classrooms, recognizing that there are many other steps as well in ensuring that all students are, afforded education, adequate education around Indigenous issues. So the process, they're revised every 10 years. And so you can go to the Minnesota Department of Education website. And if you, search Minnesota Department of Education Social Studies, it'll bring up the social studies portion of the website. And you can actually follow the process. A lot of it is public. So there is a committee of folks. I think it's 40 plus folks who are meeting to revise. And, they applied and were, vetted and accepted to be part of this process to revise the social studies standards. So the current set is from 2011. So there will be a new set that will be released, right? And it'll be interesting to see what those look like. They're in the initial stages, right, of reviewing the standards and, thinking through what some possible changes might be. I will say in terms of Indigenous education, there's a Professor Sarah Shear, who has done quite a bit of research around Indigenous representation in social studies standards around the country. And so her work, she's identified that in Minnesota, we are, we're better than, the average state in the United States in terms of indigenous, mentioning indigenous peoples within our standards, indigenous coverage within the social studies standards. But I think there's a long way to go. And certainly one issue is that most of the references to indigenous peoples or history is pre-1900. And so if you were to look at the standards, the Minnesota State Social Studies standards, most of the references to indigenous history, culture, peoples is looking at history that is pre-1900. There's very little reference to things like the important American Indian movement, right, which, is centered in Minnesota. And though there are a few references post-1900, most of the references, maybe I was misspeaking, are pre-1900, which fits with this kind of erasure in terms of settler colonialism and the erasure of indigenous folks, indigenous peoples and nations from narratives, including education.
Great. Next question up is, are Minnesotans truly living on stolen land? And if that's the case, what treaty rights claims are still outstanding in Minnesota and legally should be honored and made good with Dakota and Ojibwe tribes, assuming treaties are legal and still in effect?
I would say, first of all, that assumption that treaties are still legal is sort of a broad one. All the land that the university that my house is on was all on ceded land from Dakota treaties. That's all been abrogated. It's no longer enforceable. So in essence, the United States never held up its agreements in those treaties, because when you have the power to be able to say, you know what, let's just avoid it, it's gone. I would argue that's in essence the argument behind stolen land, right? And then we can go through some of the treaties and look at some of the annuity payments. The promise of support weren't upheld. Even I'm more familiar with Dakota treaties than I am with Ojibwe, but even in pre-1862, the United States wasn't able to uphold its annuity payments to the Dakota. So even when we have treaties in exchange for goods, are not always upheld. But there's a lot of problematics involved with treaties.
Okay. Somebody asked about the poll. If you wouldn't mind pulling up.
Oh, sure.
And if you wouldn't mind giving your perspective on the results, that'd be great. Sure.
Am I sharing it now? Can folks see it?
Yes.
All right. Perfect. Yeah. And so just thinking about treaties as, an aspect of genocide. Again, I'm very eager to read through some of the comments that folks were making. And, I think this is something, Joe and I, trying not to overstate our expertise. And certainly that has, I'm sure you've realized that, right? That we're still, thinking through a lot of this ourselves. And trying to draw some of those connections. And I could say very few Indigenous or non-Indigenous scholars have looked at treaties through this lens of genocide. Again, as Joe mentioned, taking up genocide in terms of the treatment of Native Americans and the experiences of Native Americans is, maybe not controversial is the right word, but there are people who have very strong feelings about this, and why we wouldn't use the word genocide, or why they wouldn't use the word genocide, why I would, right? And so I think, this is something in terms of treaty making that I'd like to, spend a little time thinking about, have some more conversations with folks. But certainly it's I think to think about our relationship with treaties. And, I'm someone who, and maybe Joe could offer a counterpoint here, but I'd like to really kind of extend my thinking around genocide and thinking about, settler colonialism as genocide, and thinking about our non-relationship or non-Indigenous Minnesotans relationship with treaties as maybe an aspect of this genocide. this erasure of Indigenous peoples from, the contemporary U.S. experience? I think is an interesting question for me, certainly.
There was 2 points made that I just want to address. One is the blood quorum, and that might be what some people are addressing. And then the other one is what percentage of those that attended tonight were Indigenous and responded to this survey versus those that were not.
Yeah, I will say that we could talk for a long time about blood quantum. That was sort of instilled in the Dawes Act of 1887 as a means to actually determine who qualifies as Native and who doesn't. It's something that the federal government has sort of tried to implement for, I think, for a long time. There's always been sort of an attempt to differentiate and quantify the amount of blood within Native people. Anyway, we could talk for a long time about the Dawes Act, and there's so much more than just land allotments that was founded in that. Maybe someday, Kelsey, we could talk about the Dawes Act. I don't know if I could talk for an hour, but we could talk for a long time. It's part of a series of policies that were clearly genocidal in nature in an attempt to erase Native peoples. And that's where we get away from that conversation about whether or not this is genocide. Can this or can this not be genocide? I will make the argument every day that from about the 1870s on, federal policies were genocidal in nature towards Native people.
Well, you guys, we are hitting the time. I have a pile of questions that didn't get addressed and still great things that were commented along the way. We hope to still respond to some of those. George and Joe can decide if they're going to hang out for a little bit. We'll do that recording, I think. And if you guys are willing, we'll still record some answers to the questions that we still have in the future. So if you look for those, you'll see those on our website, as well as we'll send those out in the email to you, as well as resources. We want to thank George and Joe for presenting tonight. I hope you were able to get some great takeaways, everybody that got to attend. Again, if you have follow-up questions, or if you want to invite them to present for you, because that's how we got them to present for us, as we reached out and we said, we have this great topic we really would love to hear more on. Again, there's a larger amount than normal for us. So if you have questions that didn't get addressed or you didn't get into the chat, feel free to email those to me at programs@mycche.org. And I'm happy to see if we can get those addressed as well. We also invite people to suggest topic suggestions as well as presenters. And we encourage you to follow up and watch the recording and share the recording in the future. We've also worked with George and Joe on other presentations like the Indigenous people's one that we were recommending people to watch ahead of time. And so if you maybe have missed out on something we've already attended, you can check our recording section. Some of the things that we include in there are understanding trauma and other things that might feel pertinent as well. So George and Joe, I want to give you a second to chat before the time is up.
All right, perfect. Thank you, everyone, so much for attending, and yeah, we look forward to engaging further.
Yeah, no, I appreciate this opportunity, and I'm happy to talk about this. I think it's such a critical issue that, especially as George and I work on these topics, probably almost on a daily basis. We clearly don't understand enough about it. Even we don't. So I'm glad that we could find so many people who are willing to engage in this topic on a Tuesday night. I really appreciate it. I appreciate Kelsey giving us this opportunity to share some of our work and the work of the center. Thanks so much.
Yes, thank you again. And there was a question about saving the chat, which I will do, and also making sure that we share out all of our resources that were presented and other additional pieces. Look for emails coming from me probably on Monday for you guys. So if you had something you really think people should know about and we didn't talk about it again for a resource, you're welcome to email me that as well.